So I was basically awakening from one lucid dream into a second, and then from a second into a third, and a third into a fourth. And you start to panic then, because you can't get out of the dream state. No matter what you do, they keep waking you up in another dream. And I think that has something to do with being exposed to it too many times over a very short period of time. But I started to panic, and then I fought that back. I tried to regain control. I said to Dr. Stephen LaBerge, who was the man running the sleep lab at Stanford, I said, am I awake or am I asleep right now? And he said, I don't know. Are you awake or are you sleeping? And I said, well, how can you tell? And he says, I can't tell you the answer to that. So I said, well, if I bite down on my arm hard enough to draw blood, then I must be awake. And he said, I don't know. And so I did that. Bit down on my arm and drew blood. I was still in the dream state.
What?
I felt the pain. I saw the blood. But later I woke up. So we had a long discussion about these false awakenings, because by the seventh false awakening, I was really, really concerned. But when I finally did actually feel awake and was able to test things, then we had a long discussion, and I said, this is very dangerous. Someone who does not have a strong understanding for what's going on could be emotionally damaged doing this, or psyche damaged. When I absolutely thought I was no longer in a dream state is when I quit, took a shower, got dressed, left the sleep lab, got in my rental car, drove back to my hotel, ate lunch, took a hot shower, climbed in my bed to watch TV, and I noticed the color of the wall change. I was still in a lucid dream. And that's when I fell out. And when I awoke, I was still in the bed. So I was no longer dreaming. Or was I?
Right before the record, we were talking about your retirement and what, and the discussion you had with your general at the time.
Well, it wasn't just with them. My retirement was done in secret. Because of what I did in the Army, and in order to talk about what I did, they had to hold it in camera. So, my wife was read on temporarily so she could be at my retirement, and then she had to be read off afterwards so that she couldn't talk about it.
Wow.
And and there were maybe, I honestly don't know how many people were there, because they just kept crowding in. And it pretty much colonels, light colonels, a couple majors, and one or two generals. And of course, my commanding officer at the time was General Stubblebine. I had actually worked over the period of time I was in Stargate for 5 different generals. They were all in charge of the intelligence and security command for the Army. So in the conversation that went on in my retirement, they were talking about a lot of things I did. And what my commander said, that he felt was really interesting. I don't know why, but he brought up the fact that in all the conversations he had with any of the other commanders in the room, or flag officers in the room and whatnot, he said he had never met anybody that gave me a direct order. And he asked me if that was true, and I said, well, yeah. I knew what my job was, and I was always 2 steps ahead of everybody if I could be, because that was my job. So I said I probably am one of the few people who spent 20 years in the Army and never got maybe a handful of direct orders from anybody. Usually it was to stop doing something.
Well, yeah, I mean, it does make sense the way you put it. You're hired, quote unquote. You're put in a position so that you can be 2 steps ahead. So I guess any general, any commander that you would have would understand that you need free rein in order to provide the advantage to the unit that they want you to give them.
Yeah, I was kind of an open thinker too. I mean, there's a lot of regulations in the military, and they're
Mm.
there for good reason. I mean, the military can't violate anything in the Constitution. They have to do what they're restricted to do because they're military.
Mm-hmm.
And in a free democracy, they generally respond only to whatever the policies are or whatever their guidance is from the Congress or from the president or whatever. So they don't have free reign, but within any specific thing that they're doing, they do have to be kind of open minded about how they approach it, because if you did everything according to the book, you can actually do more damage sometimes than good.
Hmm.
Because if your opponents in the world know that you're operating by the book, they can manipulate you in ways sometimes. But in my case, I just saw it as a disadvantage because I came up in the enlisted ranks. And in my 96 months in Europe, we had isolated detachments that never had more than maybe 12 to 15 people. And they were on uh, border operations. And they always had first lieutenants or captains running these detachments until I got there. And there was a problem with one of the detachments I can't go into, but I just stepped up and said, "Oh, I'll take care of that." And they laughed. They thought it was comical because I was an E6 at the time, staff sergeant. And but the colonel who I'd been working for knew me really well, so he said, "I'm going to send you out there just to see if you can fix this." And after that, it just kind of opened the door for senior enlisted to be able to run these detachments, and it freed up a lot of officer material to be elsewhere doing other jobs that required more authority. Uh, but it raised some questions too. I mean, I remember one inspection visit where I had the colonel visiting me, and in my detachment, we of course had a building where we housed people, and it was like an apartment building. We had a nice dining room there, and we're sitting in the dining room, and he noticed that all the plates and the silverware were identified as officer club material.
Officer
And he
club.
said, he's
Yeah.
club, like right out of an officer's club.
Yeah.
And we were all enlisted, of course. And he said, where'd this come from? And he said, I said, well, I went to Bremerhaven, the supply depot, and I got everything I needed for my dining room. And he said, but this is stuff they use in officer clubs. And I said, yeah. And I said it was nicer material. I didn't want plain old dishes and things. And so he says, how did you get this? And I said, I just told him I was a commander. And he said, but you're not an officer. And I said, doesn't matter. I'm still a commander. And I was able to sign for it as a commander. So that's kind of like lightly bending a rule, maybe.
You know, we never talked about your upbringing. So that kind of gutsy attitude, especially if somebody who's young in their career, living in another country, and um, making those kinds of decisions, I have to assume that it's got to do a lot with your upbringing. So tell me if this is a stretch. You grew up in Miami, and you grew up in a kind of a bad part of town, a rough part of town. I shouldn't say bad,
Right.
rough. I can't, like, I don't know. I want you to tell us. You were surrounded by gangs.
Oh, yeah. There were at least two or three gangs in my area, all vying, of course, for being in control of the neighborhood.
Hmm.
And I was one of the very few uh, young white men in the area, and so boys in the area, and they were trying to recruit me. because I could go places and do things they might not have been able to do, and I
Hmm.
just adamantly refused to join a gang. So you had to develop a perception that you weren't recruitable, and but the perception couldn't go too far because you'd be challenging. So
Yeah.
you kind of walk a fine line there. But what had more to do with my attitude in the Army is the fact that when I was finally sent to Vietnam, I was extremely young, and I'd already become staff sergeant. And staff sergeants operate at the platoon level, which is somewhere between 50 and 60 people. And so I was assigned to be responsible for a platoon, and I was just turned 21 in age, and I had absolutely no experience at it. So you learn quick.
Wow.
You either learn quick or you wind up in jail or dead, one or the other, in a combat zone. So, you just become more mature very quickly when you're responsible for the lives of 50 people, 56 people.
I'm going to tell you with no hesitation, I was nowhere near making any kind of decisions for anybody's life, including my own at 21. So
Yeah. Well, people don't realize when young soldiers go to war, they're generally somewhere between 17 and 20.
yeah.
And that's the prime period of really experiencing life in the beginning as a young person. I mean, you don't really, your brain doesn't even fully develop before
No.
25 or
Yeah.
26. So, these very young guys, their youth is sort of stolen from them in a sense because they have to grow up very fast and face things that most adults have difficulty with. And I think it's done that way because if they were older, they would probably balk at some of the jobs that they were faced with
Right.
because they would know too much.
Yes.
I don't know if that's making any sense here, but it's the very reason why when we came back from Vietnam, any of us came back from Vietnam, we were kept separate, completely separate, and separated away from the young men that were going over for the first time. We knew too much, and if you know too much going into a war zone, you're more protective of your health and more restricted in the way you might respond to certain circumstances. So it takes a young man to fight a war, but it ruins the young man in the process. They become adults, older adults, very fast. And a lot of people don't recognize the impact that has on their life when they then become mid 20s and they're out of the military, and everybody around them is basically ahead of them in the industries and in the office buildings and in the normal jobs of reality in life. And they have way more maturity to some extent. Not across the board, certainly, but to some extent, that you feel a huge loss when you return.
Because you really have a gain. Like those are
Mm-hmm.
visceral gains of knowledge that no one else could understand. So it because then you feel at a loss in a society that hasn't had those experiences and therefore doesn't value them, because to move on in your career you don't need those kinds of experiences, which could make that 25-year-old war veteran feel so lonely and isolated, but yet
Yeah,
so illuminated.
yeah. Mostly the impact comes when you're faced with moral issues or what appear to be simplistic issues in a job, where someone might be, uh, I don't know, taking something from the job site because it's some small item, like he needs nails to repair his garage or something. So he pockets nails and takes them home with him. And the vet won't do that. It's kind of like, no, that you take these little things, and these little things could be impacting on life in some other respect for someone else, or it impacts on the job and being able to complete the job in a moral and straightforward way. And then there's the opposite effect, where they matured in understanding what they can get away with, but didn't mature in their own personal morality or ethics.
Right.
So, and there's no attempt to define any of that for the experienced person coming back from a war. They have to sort of self-define it, and if they define it wrongly, they wind up in jail. If they define it a right way, they usually bite down and on the being able to talk about it. They just don't. They don't do it. They just hide it all. Yeah, either way, it's damaging.
I can only try to imagine if you look at human history as a continuous string of stories based on battles and war and murder and conquering. It doesn't matter the tribe, the cities, the civilization, the country. It's that is a human phenomenon. Like how much of that damage, quote unquote, gets transferred to the next generation, and then next generation, and
Right.
we all become part of a damaged soup.
Well, yeah. Well, it in some cases, it's hard to explain. In some cases, there's benefit, and in other cases, it's extremely damaging.
Sure.
But in both cases, the person who's expressing that has no guidance, no professional instruction on how to approach it or think about it, or even, what's correct and not correct in a society.
Yeah, well, I
There are
guess in a
good,
sense that's also sorry to interrupt, Joe, because I'm visualizing the example you gave about the separation from the 21-year-old veterans coming back, and then the 17-year-olds leaving and keeping them separated. Like already, what's imbued is the lack of a mentorship structure.
right, exactly. And
So
in
did
fact,
yeah,
I was going to say, in fact, what I don't know about other militaries, but in the U.S. military, the person who has experienced deep inroads into combat, where life and death is a daily act, those young people, uh, they try to drive those young people out of the military.
mm,
They don't want them to remain in the military because they now represent a huge moral issue, that almost that no one can dictate to. They either moralize what they've been involved in a way that makes them stronger, or it tears them apart. But in either way, it makes them hard to handle. So in my own case, I could actually see that at 21. They called me Pop because I was 21 and had a lot of responsibility. That's the only reason. But I came back to the States and I could see that people were being deliberately ushered out of the military because of their experience. And rather than do that, I took an assignment to Europe. And I spent a long time overseas because that was
96
a way
months.
of avoiding being extricated.
Wow. I mean, so you doing the math at 96 months, what is that, 8 years? 7 years?
That's just the European assignments. I actually was a little over 14 years straight overseas.
Wow. Wow. Um, quick switch over to, because I wanted to discuss this the last time and we ran out of time. Your work, and some of your work is now showcased in the National Security Museum.
Right.
Tell
National
us a little bit
Security
about that.
Agency. Yeah. The NSA, uh, has a museum. It's an unclassified museum. What's what's really nice about their museum is every single item in their museum is standalone, one of a kind. It they don't exist anywhere else in the world. For instance, the Enigma machines that were used during the Second World War for encryption are all three rotor machines. There was a single set of four rotor machines that existed at the time of the war, and that was Hitler's uh, personal machine. And I guess the other end it might have received any messages from it. They actually have a Hitler's personal four rotor machine on display at the NSA Museum.
Mm.
Now, it's one of a kind. There is no other Hitler, no other four rotor machine. So that's a kind of uniqueness to this system. They also have what's interesting to me is in my operations in Vietnam, we used a device. It was called an ANPRD-1, and the ANPRD-1 was supposedly a man-pack, a piece of electronic equipment for radio direction finding (RDF). What's fascinating about this piece of equipment is with the batteries and the two parts to the machine and its antenna system and the stand it stood on, it was 186 pounds. So that's hardly man pack. But
It's another human being.
the only way we could use it would be to either carry it on our backs or to put it in a Jeep and try to get a Jeep close to the area of operation that we wanted to use it in. Its range was very short, very finite for triple canopy jungles. So usually had to be within 1,500 meters, 2,000 meters of the actual targeted radios. That puts you squarely in the area of operation of the enemy. That would be the operational area that they control. So, to my knowledge, there were something like 6 or 7 of these machines. They're all gone except for one, which is sitting in the NSA museum because it's one of a kind. It's the only one left.
Mhm.
Well, I operated one of those in Vietnam. The first man in Vietnam that was killed in 1965, early 65, was a man that they named the first intelligence operation in the building. They named the building after him, and I think his last name was Davis. I'm not absolutely sure now, but he was the first person that used one in Vietnam, and he was killed. He was operating with a squad of South Vietnamese soldiers, and when they were attacked, they ran away, and he simply ran out of bullets. And so these machines were extremely difficult to use, carry, move, that sort of thing. And I'm one of the few people that actually operated with these things. And mine was what you call a combat loss. We had to put a thermite on it and pull the pin on the thermite and melt it down because we couldn't evacuate with it out of the area we were using it in. So I'm one of the few people that ever operated one and survived.
Wow.
Not much of a claim, I'll tell you.
This museum's in Washington, is that right?
Yeah, it's in Washington. It's right in front of the NSA buildings.
Okay.
You can't miss the NSA buildings. They're two huge copper-colored cubes. And this is a partially in-ground building that's brand new, and they have all the one-of-a-kind things in there. Well, one of the displays is now 6 of my responses, remote viewing responses, that were solutions to some significant problems. And all 6 are one-of-a-kind demonstrations of remote viewing because it was an operational target. It was one response, my response. It was one drawing, my drawing, and it solved the whole thing.
Hmm.
And and of course the award I got for the reports on the I and a man named Hartley Trent did with regard to the Typhoon class submarine. My award is on display there as well. So it's one of a kind. It's permanent, and it's now going to be put on online, so it'll be accessible when they release the online museum anywhere in the world.
You told me as well that the CIA told or let the NSA know not to do it, not
Oh
to.
yeah, according to the director of the museum,
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't verify that other than what he told me. He said that the CIA was not pleased when they put this in the museum because it's a direct answer to the fact that the CIA says remote viewing was never of any value,
Hmm.
basically. And NSA is saying, no, it was of extreme value, and they used it quite a bit, and it was very valuable to them. So it's kind of like a stick in your eye kind of thing. They're refusing to take it down because it is a one of a kind display. Uh, it's in the same room as the oldest encryption book known, which is from the 1400s. Some
What?
monk, yeah, some monk wrote a book on encryption from the 1400s. I think he died at the stake, burned at the stake for
Of
heresy
course.
or something. But it's an amazing book. I mean, it's right there. You can actually read the pages.
Do you remember the monk's name?
No, I don't. I'd have to go back to the museum and collect it. But
Yeah,
I'm sure
yeah.
that'll wind up online as well. I mean, it's an incredible museum.
Wow.
Um, they have three of the first or original Cray computers, which were all built by a man named Cray. They were supercomputers, and they don't hold a candle, of course, today to the computers that exist. But
Sure.
back in his day, some of those computers have literally hundreds of miles of wiring in them, and he built them by hand. And they have to be in an ice cold room, and some of them actually have I ice fluid running through them to cool them down. They're just
Wow.
amazing computers.
I listened to an interview that Skip Atwater gave.
Uh-huh.
And in that interview, they were talking about a remote viewing experience that was more that became. Please correct me if I'm mistaken. That became an out of body experience, and from what I remember, it was a shared experience with you and he. And he told the interviewer, "Ask Joe about the grassy knoll."
Yeah. Um,
So I'm asking
you
you now.
know, it's hard. You got to understand that uh, at that time in my career, the only exposure I had to anything paranormal was the operations that we were involved in using remote viewing. So, having said that, uh, what people continually mix because they don't possess sufficient knowledge yet. The differences between remote viewing, psychic functioning, lucid dreaming, or psychic functioning and remote viewing within a lucid dream, or out of body, or belief in out of body based on a different perception of the space they're operating in or the situation they're operating in. For instance, disassociation, which is a psychological term for being in an altered state that you've self-induced. And then you have hypnosis and a whole bunch of other things thrown in there. The difficulty is, unless you've had experiences in all of those and can tell the differences based on the refined small differences between each, it's difficult for someone to say, yeah, I was out of body, I was not in a lucid dream. The, the difficulty is most people can't. They can't tell the difference. And so you have researchers, scientists studying out of body and lucid dreaming, and they can't tell the difference. And talking to someone, the way they explain their experience, it's very easy to say, oh, well, they were definitely out of body. You can't say that. Maybe it was a lucid dream. They don't know the differences. And so there are actual reports, scientific reports even floating around, where the researcher, because they lacked sufficient experience in researching the paranormal, or the subject matter, the people who are the subjects of that research, definitely don't know the difference, because all they've been doing is a lucid dream their whole life, or out of body their whole life. It mixes everything together. So it could be that we met on a grassy knoll in the out of body one evening while we were both working on the same problem. Or it could be that we both had lucid dreams about the difficulty of the problem and working on it in our head through some form of slight disassociation or altered state, and assumed it was out of body. At the time, I certainly did not know enough because I was just a soldier doing remote viewing that I'd been exposed to. So, who can say? Now, that's certainly his perception, and I honor his perceptions, because he was a training officer for the remote viewing unit, and he successfully guided us through remote viewing when no one else was accepting it at all. So I honor his ability to at least understand the remote viewing problems and the problems of, the dynamics that come along with doing remote viewing in a military. He was a very good training officer, and I appreciate what he's done. But whether or not it was out of body, I can't say for sure.
Well, let's go back to some of the definitions that you gave, because
Uh-huh.
you explained a harrowing story back a few of our episodes together ago about getting stuck in a lucid dream.
Yeah.
Or
Oh, yeah.
stuck in a loop. That was terrifying to hear.
Yeah.
Why do we, or why can some of us, or why does lucid dreaming exist?
I think what lucid dreaming is a perception that we're not in our bodies dreaming, but we're actually in the dream. So the fact that we are self-creating a dream and that we're operating in that dream and become awake and aware that we're in a dream at the same time, that's what makes it lucid. Most people that are dreaming will suddenly come awake because of some frightening thing happening in the dream, and they'll realize, oh my God, that was only a nightmare, or that was a dream. Few people will recognize when they're in a dream that it is actually a dream and they're sleeping. Once in a while, that happens. Or some people can develop the capability that when they're in a dream, they can recognize the fact and become awake and aware consciously that they're in a dream, which then permits them to become very manipulative with that dream. In other words, you can alter it. You can make things happen in the dream that otherwise would just happen naturally. So, lucid dreaming it's difficult it's a skill set that's difficult to develop. But once developed, it's an amazing thing which you can use for a whole lot of different reasons. In my case, I was able to develop the capacity for doing a lucid dream, become awake and aware, knowing that I was consciously asleep and dreaming, and that I was in a dream, and then using that to do remote viewing and actually go to a remote viewing site which connects the two, So it's a lucid dream with a remote viewing. Uh, it's hard to explain that, but you can actually see it occur if the person is hooked up to an EEG, and you can see the what's going on in the brain. Because in dreaming, you know somebody's in a dream because they go through a certain series of reactions when they're being monitored, physically monitored, and their mind will produce sleep spindles, and then it will go into REM, and the REM nodes tell them very clearly the person's asleep and dreaming. So when the person becomes awake and aware in the dream, consciously knowing they're asleep and dreaming, what they can do is if they stop in the dream and look over their left and right shoulders 4 times very rapidly, what happens is there's 4 little tiny spikes appear on the REM node itself. And
Hmm.
that the person monitoring the physical monitoring will then know they're awake and aware in their dream and can issue a target. Uh, it's complicated.
Well,
Well,
make me understand a little bit because we took it for granted when you explained it that the your commanders, the military, had assigned you to do this sort of thing for 14 months at the Monroe Institute.
right.
And I took it for granted that it happened. But here's what should have been my question. I'll ask it now. Why remote view through lucid dreaming? What is the difference between the remote viewing exercises in a lucid dream and in your wake state?
Well, I'm going to correct one thing first.
Yeah.
I didn't go to the institute and work with Bob Monroe to control lucid dreaming. That was a simple thing for me to learn on my own.
Okay.
I went and spent 14 months in a lab with Bob Monroe learning to control my out of bodies, which is completely
Okay.
different from lucid dreams. Okay. But going
Got
to
it.
the lucid dream, once I'm awake and aware that I'm dreaming, I would signal them. And then my job was to go to the lab where they generated a photograph of a target. And that was being done on a screen inside a locked closet that was dark. And they had duct tape around the edges of the closet door. So no one would know what the target was. It was just generated automatically. And so for me to be able to report on that target, I would have to be in the dream state, finding the lab, going through the door into the closet in the dark, and seeing what the picture was. So when this occurred and I notified them that I was awake and aware in my dream, I was sitting leaning up against a tree on this grassy knoll, and uh, no way to know where the target was, the lab was, or where the closet was, any of that. And so I had to invent something in a dream state that would work to get me to the target. So what I decided to do is I would do what Dorothy would do in The Wizard of Oz. I'd close my eyes, click my heels together, and when I opened my eyes, I'd be standing in the actual photograph. And that's what I did. And I found myself standing in an alpine valley covered with wildflowers, snow-capped mountains surrounding me, and giant Christmas trees. And down at the bottom of this valley was a small road that led to a barn. And so I went down the road in my dream and entered the barn. And what was interesting, in my dream, entering the barn, I was hit with the smells of the barn, and I started having flashbacks to when I was a child working on my grandfather's farm.
Wow.
So things started appearing. And so I walked around in the barn. I walked around outside. There was a Mercedes parked outside, which I found to be interesting, but there were no keys in it. Otherwise, I would have tried to start it. But after a few hours of walking around in this alpine valley, exploring this barn, I stopped, looked over my left and right shoulders very rapidly 4 times, which was a signal that I had obtained the material and they were to wake me up. And when they saw the second set of spikes on the rim, they wakened me. And then I sat in my study alcove where they do all this work in the sleep lab, and spoke into a microphone, talked about the target, and then drew it the best I could to memory. And it turns out it was a perfect overlay, my drawing in the actual photograph, which no one even knew until they retrieved the number for the photograph that had been displayed on the computer in the closet. What's fascinating about this is I did that a number of times, very accurately. Some of the accuracy was a little flawed, maybe on a couple of the targets, but the time I spent on the target, to me in my dream, appeared to be maybe an hour or longer. But in the spikes on the rim nodes, from the first set of spikes to the second, was only seconds.
Mm.
So the time differential was huge. And then the secondary thing that occurred after doing this for approximately 4 or 5 days is I started awakening. Them would wake me up, and I would talk into the mic for 20 minutes, do the drawing, get up to go to the men's room, unplug the umbilical with all my cords coming out of my skull, and I'd walk to the men's room, and I'd go inside, and it would be dark, so I'd hit the light switch, and nothing would happen. And my first thought was, oh, maybe there's a power failure. And then I looked, and my finger was passing through the wall switch. So I was basically awakening from one lucid dream into a second, and then from a second into a third, and a third into a fourth. And you start to panic then, because you can't get out of the dream state. No matter what you do, they keep waking you up in another dream. And I think that has something to do with being exposed to it too many times over a very short period of time.
Mm.
But I started to panic, and then I fought that back. I tried to regain control. I said to Dr. Stephen LaBerge, who was the man running the sleep lab at Stanford, I said, am I awake or am I asleep right now? And he said, I don't know. Are you awake or are you sleeping? And I said, well, how can you tell? And he says, I can't tell you the answer to that. So I said, well, if I bite down on my arm hard enough to draw blood, then I must be awake. And he said, I don't know. And so I did that. Bit down on my arm and drew blood. I was still in the dream state. I saw the pain. I saw the blood. But later I woke up. So we had a long discussion about these false awakenings, because by the seventh false awakening, I was really, really concerned. But when I finally did actually feel awake and was able to test things, then we had a long discussion, and I said, this is very dangerous. Someone who does not have a strong understanding for what's going on could be emotionally damaged doing this, or psyche damaged. And so we decided to terminate the rest of the experiment.
If you remained long enough in these nested or looped lucid dreams,
Mm-hmm.
do you think you would eventually just have permanently left your body?
Well, I was never out of my body. I was in my head dreaming.
Mm-hmm.
That's a difference from being out of body. Out of body is being physically relocated somewhere else in all respects.
Sure.
Nothing changes. In other words, if you're like in your bedroom and you go out of body and you're in the out of body state and you're at a hardware store, okay, you are completely, totally at the hardware store. All your senses, everything is at the hardware store. Now, The way you can tell the difference between a lucid dream in a hardware store or being out of body is nothing will change. There's nothing you can do in the out of body state that will change anything in that hardware store. In
Mm.
other words, the wall coloring will remain the same. The tools will never change bends. The tools, some will never fade away and others replace them. In other words, there won't be minute changes which occur in dream state. You understand?
So, but in a way, if you're out of body, you're more trapped because you can't change. And the way you described at the beginning of this, the lucid dream, you explained that you were creating scenes. Like it feels like the lucid dreaming state is a more creative one. Like you can use your imagination and go.
Yes, you can, but at the same time, things will change in your perception, and you may or may not notice them. For instance, when I absolutely thought I was no longer in a dream state is when I quit,
Yeah.
took a shower, got dressed, left the sleep lab, got in my rental car, drove back to my hotel, ate lunch, took a hot shower, climbed in my bed to watch TV, and I noticed the color of the wall change. I was still in a lucid dream. And that's when I fell out. And when I awoke, I was still in the bed. So I was no longer dreaming. Or was I?
Or
You
were you?
see the difference? There's a huge difference there because one you are absolutely in control of. The other you have no control whatsoever, and it will change constantly. Lucid dreaming, you are never in control, really. It will change on its own in spite of what you may or may not be able to control in it. In the out of body state, nothing changes. It's
Hmm.
all exactly the same. And when you're no longer in the out of body state, you're back in your body. It's an automatic. It's you either travel back to your body or you're connected to your body and you return. You can go deep into the universe and look at different solar systems and still travel backwards to your body or get snapped back into your body. And
Yeah.
there's physical knowledge that you just came from wherever you were back into your body. But in the interim, all the things you did in the out of body state, it is nothing that will change. Going to a target in the out of body state is just like getting in a car, driving there, getting out, and walking into the target building. It's the
Okay.
same thing. Nothing changes. The difference in the out of body state and actuality walking into the building is that you can actually pass through a wall in the out of body state, pass through a vault door into a vault room in the out of body state. You can actually interact by passing through things. Now you can't open a drawer. You can't do anything in the out of body state that's a direct interaction other than pass through things because it's kind of like an offset of reality for which you can't access, but you can manipulate by passing through or visualizing or smelling or touching or sensing or tasting or whatever. You just can't physically move something in the out of body state. But in a lucid dream, you can because you're in control of the dream. It's getting out of it that becomes the horrifying part of it, the scary part of it.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
in reality, being unable to become awake, fully awake from a lucid dream, is terrifying in that you finally reach a point where you you can't think of another way of getting out of it. You don't have any control over what's happening. Uh, and then the question enters on are when we're awake and aware and not in a lucid dream, is that real, or is that just a prolonged lucid dream that we're here participating in? And I think there's a question there that becomes really critically important. But I couldn't get an answer to it from anybody because they don't know. I didn't know, and I still to this day can't understand how to deal with that. That's why it's so frightening.
Hmm.
But in the out of body, you're either out or you're in.
Well, I, I'm going to say that both scenarios seem equally exciting for me than as terrifying. Because the out of body, like, it seems like that experience would be proof that we're not just physical beings. I mean, if you can
Yeah,
pass through things and see things that you can't otherwise physically, and I mean, we're talking to you because you're living testament that the military understood that this is something that exists. They didn't invent it, right? They didn't invent it. And then the lucid dream, like I don't know enough people. I haven't asked enough questions. Actually, that's the real thing. But the people who have shared with me their experience in lucid dreaming, I understand that it's an experience that makes you feel more alive than your waking state. Like people are excited. They come back excited and impassioned about their experience in the lucid state.
yeah,
Um,
because you feel like you have some control, but you really don't. That's the problem.
mhm.
Most people, when they're dreaming, they wake up. In most dreams, you have a sense of waking up.
Yeah.
Usually you're frightened out of the dream, or something happens, like somebody slams the door and you wake out of it. But there's always some sort of automatic thing that happens that brings you out of a dream. Okay. In the out of body state, that's simple. You wind up back in your body and it's an
Yeah. You get
automatic.
sucked in.
Yeah. It's an automatic. It's going to happen. I've never been out of body and was not back in my body. Some of the other differences are kind of unique. In the out of body state, where you have all the control in the world on where you go and what you do, when you've mastered being able to separate, the secondary problem becomes one of amazement. What you're talking about, uh, kind of coming out of the lucid dream. If you, let's say you want to go from here to the gas station down at the end of the block in the out of body state, and you've mastered separating from your body. So you're out of body and you're backing away from your body, and you back into a massive crystal chandelier. Guess what you're going to do? You're not going to go to the gas station down the end of the block. You're going to spend hours in that crystal chandelier, because the experience of being in the rainbows of light, the interaction of light between one piece and another, is so fantastic. You can't let go of it. You understand?
Hmm. Well, I
That's an
want to say I do
experience.
understand.
That's like a brilliant experience that you can't have anywhere else in the world. And it's mystifying. It's like it really grabs you, and it's like, wow, this is truly amazing. So in the out of body state, there are things that will catch your interest very simply, very easily. They should catch your interest anyway in the body state. Okay. It's
Hmm.
just that you never spend any time looking with true serious insight at a large crystal chandelier. But the out of body state, being in it, you get it all. And that will occupy you for hours. And you will find it irresistible. You cannot separate from it. So it's kind of a wasted out of body. And the difficulty is when you're looking for a target in the out of body state, that would be a specific building. They can't tell you where it is because you'll automatically access it using viewing. So they give you a picture and they say, find the building. So you're going out of body maybe 15 times, crossing all over vast amounts of space, looking for that specific building. it's tiresome. It wears you down. I think the 2 targets I did in the out of body state took minimum 2 weeks, 3 weeks, going out of body 3 or 4 times a night just to find the target. It's a waste of energy. Especially since I can access it with viewing in seconds, and it's not a matter of difficulty. Uh, yeah, I mean, it's a lack of understanding for what the limits are, what the excessive limits are, and the short view is of the capacity for whatever those things are. And most people, you have to learn the differences between them in order to truly understand what you can do with them. And some you can control and some you can't.
Have you ever met or seen or communicated with any other entity in those states or in any state?
Yes. Yes.
You
In the
have.
in the out of body state.
Oof.
And I have to say it was an intelligent entity. It did not strike me as being alive, but it did strike me as being informationally real. In other words, I went out when I started learning to control the out of bodies. There were times when I would have a spontaneous out of body, and since I had learned control, I could stay out. In each of those times, I would find myself gravitating to the same street corner. And when I got to the street corner, I would stand, right where the 2 streets intersected, and I'd be actually seeing cars and people there. Not many, but some. And this very strange vehicle would pull up, but it would be like not quite visible in the real, but sort of visible. And the door would open, and it looked like a cab, but it didn't have wheels. And there was an entity inside that had, from about the chest up, looked human. From the chest down was mechanically involved with the actual vehicle. In other words, in part of that vehicle. And this entity would always say, "Step in." And I would get in. This door would materialize, and there would be a couple snaps of the finger, and I would be somewhere weird. And this entity would say, "Check this out. Look at this. Look at that." And in some cases, I had no idea what I was looking at or why. And in other cases, it made perfect sense. So this would reoccur numerous times when I would have spontaneous out of body. So I have no idea why I was being shown some of this, but some of it was very weird, and some of it was not so weird. I mean, it's kind of hard to explain.
How do you know you were being showed and you weren't creating it?
Well, it's very, very true. That's a hard thing to say. You can't tell the difference because I'm in the vehicle being taken somewhere. I was assuming I was being shown, but that's an assumption. You're right. I could be the vehicle and the entity.
Huh. Yeah, I'm not casting criticism here at all. I'm just asking
No,
to see if
but it clouds the whole issue about now. Am I in a lucid dream, or am I really out of body, or am I?
yeah.
I don't know. There weren't enough parameters to be able to say, and that's one of the difficulties. That's when I started recognizing, unless you're truly completely in one of those states, it's very difficult to say what state you're in. And for me, if that's difficult for me, you can imagine how difficult that would be for someone who's only experienced 2 of 5 states. And we want to study that. And we have researchers that know all about it. No. It's like remote viewing. There's a certain point you reach in remote viewing where you can no longer study it. When my dear friend and almost brother, Dr. May, comes up, who I worked with for 45 years, and he says, You need to get a lot of rest tonight. We're going to work on a really difficult problem in the morning. I just got the answer. So how are we going to study that?
Yeah. How are you going to study that?
Yeah.
The little boy in me tells me there's only one way to study is do it again.
Yeah. Over and over and over.
Yeah.
That may be the reason I go somewhere in the cab,
Well, yeah, right.
because
Yeah.
I get to see something really fascinating and fantastical that I wouldn't see any other place.
Well, isn't that the key? Like, we had a talk recently with a zoologist, and at 21, unlike you, I mean, you were in Vietnam, but at 21, he just picked
Sure.
up. He was like a small town boy in Ontario, Canada. He
Mhm.
picked up and went to South Africa to help rewild tigers.
Whoa, wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
Very cool.
so I asked him about fear. So he spent his entire adult life with big animals, big cats,
Yeah.
and he says I was more curious than I was afraid.
Yeah. That and he probably understood there are laws of interaction with the cats just as strong as interactions between humans.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and if you're not curious, you can't understand that there maybe are those laws. that,
Yeah.
that there is a reason, that there is a pattern, that there is something there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I've been charged by a bear twice, and I'm talking big bear, big black bears. And I stand my ground. I put my hands up like this, and I
Sure.
just talk calmly, like, "What's wrong with you, Mister Bear?" And they charge right up to me. They actually skid on the ground trying to stop, and they open their jaws and they put their face right in my face and go ah, and like it's supposed to terrify me. And since I predominantly don't have fear about much of anything anymore, that it surprises the bear. I think I wind up with bear spit all over me, and then they drop their head and back away and turn and go away. It's like they realize that I'm not a threat. It's interesting.
That's a great metaphor for a lucid dream.
Yeah, it's it's my curiosity exceeds my intelligence in some degree. I don't. It's like when I first started with the remote viewing, and then got more into like lucid dreaming and out of body and all that. I started having a great deal of fear because I started feeling it. And it's not the emotion of it. There's actually a sense that says you should fear this. And I talked to my now passed father-in-law, uh, Bob Monroe, and I said, I'm having this fear. Well, like right at separation, this terrible fear that I'm in the room with some primal evil thing. And he said, "Oh, don't worry about it. You'll figure it out." And I said, so you've had this?" He said, "Oh yeah, but you'll figure it out." He never once told me. And by the time I figured it out, I went, "Oh, geez, that's what it was. That's bizarre." And what it was a sense of my own physical presence. I could feel and sense the primitive presence of my body, and it frightened me. And that's when I said that this must be the the difference between the physical presence and the spiritual presence. And so I tried to understand how those two could be separated, and I couldn't do it. And so the answer I arrived at was, as long as you were strong in your spiritual presence, then there should be no fear, broadcasting out of who and what you are. And so I started looking at life differently. Like the mere presence in reality is a point of statement. And if your intentions are good and your spiritual nature is good, even if the physical world harms you, you're at no loss. I don't know if I'm being clear, but
Crystal.
it's like, no, you just don't exude fear. It goes away. It took decades for me to come to the conclusion that we frighten ourselves, we scare ourselves, we make ourselves dark and primitive in our thoughts. If we just avoid that and speak to our higher nature, think in our higher nature, operate in our higher nature, it's a lot better for everything, everyone in reality around us. So that's what I try to do. I'm not saying I don't get angry. Sometimes I do, but it's hard to fight it back. But you can still try.
Let's leave it on that high, Joe. Those are words that are going to bring the rest of the day for me.
Mm.
Thank you.
Listen, Luciano. Everything I say, I can tell you is couched in one thing, and it's couched in the understanding that that's what I have, the conclusion I've come to, and it would be wrong for me to hide any of that. But at the same time, it speaks to the fact that I don't think me or any other human being is not without frailty or fault or mistake or any of that. I think this is a place where we learn. And if we are serious in our contemplations about what's going on around us, then we learn. It's when we react out of emotion or react out of no thought that it's a serious problem, or out of our personal desire to satisfy us and not pay attention to the fact that we're all human, becomes something that's not good.
I wrote down 3 words. And you said earlier, we frighten ourselves.
Yeah.
How many of our problems are rooted in the fact that we choose to frighten ourselves rather than open up and face the bear?
Yeah. It's can't hurt us. We cannot cure. We're information, basically, and information is energy. And it can be altered, but it can't be destroyed. It can be slightly changed. It can't be destroyed. It can be massively changed and not be destroyed. So we're like walking around in a certain set of clothing right now as humans in this physical reality. When we're no longer in this physical reality, we're still who we are, but we'll change. And it will either be for the good or the bad or the indifferent or whatever. I don't know. I think that our change will represent how and what we live by. In other words, how we view ourselves is how we stay. And I just see myself as an intelligent entity.
Just more curious than anything else.
Try to be.
So much, again, a thank you. So much a pleasure. Joe, I think there's still room for more. I still have notes that we haven't gone through.
Okay.
Well, we will do this again, hopefully, if you want to.
Sure. Absolutely. You don't want to cover one more thing?
Oh, no, because I know it's not going to be one more thing. I have 6 more. I have 6 left on my list.
Yeah.
But,
well, we can always talk again.
Thanks, Joe.
Hey, you're welcome, man. Glad to see you again. We'll see each other again, I'm sure.